finish this up. The cry of suffering. In my introductory notes, the last time, 2 weeks ago, that I introduced this message to you, I was bringing up things by Carolyn Hunt. That's still the same. I had a long talk with Carolyn yesterday, and after we talked about the physical things and what she's going through, I said, "How are you doing spiritually?" And she said, "Brother Stayton," she said, "sometimes I just start crying when nobody's in the house. I just cry." I said, "Well, that's good to hear. Crying is a wonderful gift from God. And when you're having a great deal of suffering, understand when I'm differentiating suffering from pain. Suffering can mean pain, but suffering can be in other ways that we might not traditionally think of it. But I think it meant a whole lot of things. I think it meant her family. I think she meant her life. She's just not ready to turn loose. And you have to think about things like that. It all just goes together for this cry of suffering. I told her that I was preaching on this and that it would be on the internet. I want her to be able to use this to make it be a strength to her. She's over her radiation treatments, but she's now faced with chemotherapy. At least there's a possibility of chemotherapy. But my intent in giving you all of that for this is because we're going to suffer. We're just going to have it. And we end up with some good news, too, that happens. David Lewis. I just talked with Harvey about that, and I told him as he was giving me all the details, I have to put that together in my mind and think, how can I tell the church what's happening with an individual and for it to come across? There's a lot of good things that are happening to his dad right now, really good things. His body make sure that I have this right, his body is not producing the cancer cells now. Am I right about that? The body is not producing cancer cells. Still, there are other things that need to be done, but praise the Lord for that. But he was telling his dad, he said, "Dad, you need to write a book about this." Because his dad knows how to suffer. Stop and think about that. There was another guy in the Bible that wrote a book about suffering because he was good at suffering. It was Job. And some of you could probably do the same thing. Some of you have suffering that you go through all of the time, and you could write a book about it because there are people like me that are going to have their little irritating sufferings. I got a painful hip right now as I'm speaking to you, right on this side. It's from mowing the lawn today. I get aches and pains from doing normal things anymore. And that's nothing when it comes to all these other things. And I know you know that. We want to read, we want to see and really focus our attention because the day's going to come. When you're young, you just feel like you just can't be touched. I mean, you just feel like you're just going to go on and on and on and nothing bad's going to happen. And this little Jared Johnson, a young man who Jared Amix has dealt with and who was hit by a car. I visited and mentioned him to you, I think, on Sunday. I went to visit with him and had a great visit with his mother, Cindy, who was there. I'm just telling you my opinion. I don't think they know the Lord. She told me she believed, but at least their Christian language was different than ours. If they do understand, I really don't think they do. And so I want to avail myself as much as I can of exposing myself to them and others that can go. Should any of you be in Lexington and you happen to go over to UK or you're going to be there, this young man's going to be in intensive care for quite some time. And this is a very vulnerable time. And before I left, I knew she was really glad that I was there and asked me to come back. That was a really positive thing. And I know that she's been texting Jared right along about what's going on. And he's very much up to date on the things that are happening. The sad thing about suffering is that there's going to be news that's going to come to me again in the future, and probably in the near future. You know, I really thought I was going to mow my grass yesterday, and I started getting phone calls. Most of you know Mickey's been put back in the hospital. I told him I was going to tell the church to pray that God would give him a brain instead of just healing his hernia, because he went out and started weed trimming when he was supposed to be laid up for 8 weeks. And we went over to see him last night and make fun of him a little bit and give him a hard time, but pray for him. He really is in some real pain right now, and we need to ask God to help him and bring him through all of that. Lots of people, you've got your own. We're going to take prayer requests in a little while. After we have our business aspect of the service tonight, we're going to then have our prayer time. And you got people that are on your heart right now. I got people that are on my heart right now that I know are suffering. And I know that suffering, the older we get, we begin to realize, man, this ain't going away. I'm going to have to put up with this. I'm going to have to deal with this. And that's how life is. And so this is the kind of message you probably don't want to hear because, it's Wednesday night. You came to be encouraged and not discouraged, and I don't want to discourage you, but I do want to prepare you, and I really feel like God wants me to give you this message. We dealt with, I think, 4 points that we got all the way through, but let's read our text first of all. It says, this is Philippians 1, chapter 1, verses 29 and 30. For unto you it is given in the behalf of Christ, not only to believe on him, but also to suffer for his sake. Well, we need to absorb that. Dave Trevecchi is right. Americans don't want to suffer, and I'm I'm not living my life going around saying, "All right, Lord, I want to suffer today. Hit me with a car or do." I'm not out looking for suffering. It's just the fact that we live in sinful bodies and we live in a sinful world. There's going to be suffering. It's that plain and simple. Now, if you've been like me, I talked to Jared on Monday. We were discussing this young man that I was just talking about, and he said, "Are you watching anything that's on the History Channel about 9/11?" And I said, "You know what? I just don't want to watch anything on TV because the message I preached on Sunday, that wasn't a big part of it. I did a lot of research, really just looking at lots of videos on the internet, and it gets depressing after a while. I mean, all the suffering that went on and the anguish and all of it. And I thought, I just got to get away from that. And what do? Last night we go to bed and we're lying in bed and we turn on that little TV we got in bed. And what do? I turn it over on the History Channel and I watch some of the things going on 911. I just want to cry every time I think back about that. I do. And I know you're the same. But keep that in mind. Unto you it is given in the behalf of Christ, not only to believe on him, but he's saying, you're going to suffer. You're going to have suffering. Get ready. It's going to happen. Some of you are having it right now. And then the verse 30 where he says, having the same conflict which you saw in me. In other words, all he's saying in verse 30 is, look, I'm suffering right now. The Apostle Paul was in a dungeon of one kind or another, and he was suffering. He had his difficulties. Can you imagine being in a thing that it's cold and you don't have anything to keep you warm? It's damp. You all of a sudden got congestion in your chest, and you could die from any of that stuff, particularly back in that day. He knows all of that's there, but he also knows that he's in the hand of the Lord. Well, Paul was in the middle of that, and the first point that I brought to your attention, I'm going to give you a sentence or two to back up these points I'm going to give you because I want to get through the rest of it, is the choice of suffering. Suffering comes with the freedom to choose. You can let suffering affect you in a dramatic, a grouchy, grumpy way where nobody wants to be around you, or you can bear suffering in a gracious way. I know Brother Ashcraft, he used this statement to me I don't know how many times. I just get sick of hearing it. You got to remember, I was in my early 30s when I was listening to these things, and I wasn't having aches and pains and all that stuff, and he was in the middle of all kinds of difficulties in his life. He was in the middle of resigning his church, and because he just couldn't do it anymore. He was in the middle of a terrible heart condition. Even back in those days, in the summertime, he's wearing a winter coat. Not because of air conditioning inside, he's outside because his heart's only beating 16 beats a minute. He couldn't get warm, it's impossible. And during those times of suffering that he was going through, he would make this statement to me over and over again at the appropriate times. Grow old graciously. Don't be an old grouch. Even a grouch doesn't want to be around another grouch. That's what he was famous for those sayings. And he'd get a big smile on his face. Oh, he'd go like that. And he'd say, thank you, Lord. And he was always famous for making statements. He'd hit his thumb with a hammer. And, thank you, Lord, I got a thumb that I can hit with a hammer, And he did it. I thought, boy, he is as corny as they come. But he was battling suffering in his life is what he was doing. And we got a choice. We can let that get to us, or we can let it not get to us. And then a caution from suffering. Pain or suffering can warn us of danger in our life too. That's why you go to the doctor, because you're sick. You got symptoms. You got things that come out, or worn out bodies. They tell us when we need to rest, unless you're a Mickey winner and you refuse to do that, and then pay a price for it later on. And I accused him of the only reason he's doing it is getting all kinds of attention. He loves attention. His wife told me that he had to call every preacher that he knew in the United States of America. He even called Obama to let him know he was in the hospital having difficulties. And he didn't really do that. I'm embellishing all of this, of course, but I'm having a good time teasing him over all of that, and I know it's going to come back one day on me. I just hope it's not through him. And then thirdly, we looked at the character in suffering. Suffering reveals what's in our heart, and it really does. I don't know anybody that did that better than Brother Ashcraft, as I've just given you the illustration of that, but he really knew how to bear the suffering that God brought his way, and it was the character that he had in his life that it really impacted the lives of a whole lot of other people. And we're going to have an answer for the way that we're going to suffer. And then we looked at the cause of suffering. Suffering brings us face to face with eternity. Well, some of these overlap with each other, and this overlaps with point number 5 too, but it brings us face to face with eternity. All of a sudden, the important things in life aren't the things that are going on here. It isn't my plans for tomorrow. It isn't the good things that I'm going to have happen in my life, whatever those good things are. It isn't the vacation that's coming up, or it didn't name whatever good thing that you're looking forward to. All of a sudden, we're face to face with eternity, and we realize these things are very temporary. Suffering causes us to know that. And then we're going to get into point 5, and I don't think we got this far, but this is why I said it overlaps, because the change from suffering, and here's what I mean by that. Suffering loosens our grip on this life. Loosens our grip on this life. I want you to stop and think about what I'm talking about here, because in time, our work and our opinions are sought less and less. As we grow older in life, people aren't calling us as much. They're not saying, I need to counsel with you. I'm using myself as an example. All of a sudden, you begin realizing, there's been discussion like this, and it's all true. I came to this church. I guess 35 is young. Seems young to me now, but I came to this church when I was 35 years old, and there was a lot of older people in the church then. Bob, back in those days. I still remember when you guys first came, the big wreck that you had down there, you guys and all that whole thing. I'm sure you do remember it. It was back in the days when I really liked you, and I was really anxious to get you in. Just kidding, Bob. I've always liked you, always, from the day number 1 I met you. But you get the point that I'm making. Joints stiffen and ache, eyes grow dim, digestion slows, sleep comes with great difficulty in our lives. Problems loom larger and larger with the options narrowing all the time. And that happens. Pretty soon we're going to the doctor, and the doctor's saying, look, I really don't know what else to do for you. I've really run out of options. You're just going to have to live with this. Those are the kinds of things that we have to look forward to. And yet death, it puts us on the threshold of a new day. Death does. The suffering does, and the possibility of death when it's coming our age. And all of a sudden, old age is not a curse. It's a blessing, because it loosens our grip on this world. I saw how with Brother Ashcraft, particularly as he really, really got bad in the last number of months of his life. I was around him just a little bit, a couple of times, but I could see very clearly that he didn't want to live in this body that he was in. He was ready to let go of it. I'm just beginning to get the inklings of those kinds of things. And I'm saying that to you because each new pain makes this world less and less inviting to us. Until finally we're suffering so much, we're saying, Lord, I'm ready now. I've seen that time and time again on someone's deathbed, that the suffering has been so great that time and time again, they're just saying, Lord, I'm ready. You can just take me home. I'm ready to go home. That's what all of us are in the process of arriving at. So, well, I'll never get to that day. Well, you will. You'll get to that day. God intends for you to get to that day. That God intends for heaven to look precious to us. And our hold on this life not to be the kind that used to be. I want to read to you, and it would be good for you to follow me along with this. Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 1, verse 7, verses 13 and 14. I've got them together here, so just listen. Remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not. Look how he's referred to old age. While the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, listen to this, I have no pleasure in them. The suffering is so great that there's no pleasure in them. And then verse 13, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God, keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Hold God in awe in your life and obey him. That's what he's saying. For God, verse 14, for God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. I think a lot of us in here, we think that way now. Tomorrow could be the day that I'm going to face God. I like the way Sam put it in Sunday school. I was just told about it. I wasn't in there, but Sam had shared with the class, and most of you already know this, a 44-year-old woman right here in our own community. And there she is in her house, and the people that are in there with her, all of a sudden they heard a thump. 44 years old, she dropped dead. See, it's not just the old age, but here's the point I want to get to before it escapes my mind. As I get older, and if this is going to be my day, if I'm going to collapse in the pulpit before this message is over, I want to know that my heart's right with God. I don't want to stand before him ashamed. I want to know that whatever there is in my life, it's okay. And that God's pleased with me, as pleased as he can be with me. And I think if you were to talk to the others that are my age, because I'm the older generation now. I'm looking at the ones that were just little kids that I used to have a blast with, playing wiffle ball and making fun of them and doing it. And now they're grown adults and productive in their life, and they've got their own lives, and they've got their own kids, and you're seeing all that stuff. And now here I am, 66 years old, and I see all of this and look at it in an entirely different way. There's a confidence that comes from suffering. That's point number 6. Suffering gives to us the opportunity to trust God, because that's what it does. It finally strips you down until you're at a place where there is nowhere else to look. All of your friends, and as wonderful as life may have been to you in so many ways, and as much as this church will pray for you, all of a sudden you realize, man, this is between me and God. My days are very numbered. I don't have a whole lot of them. You may not want to call them older days, but nevertheless they're there. Let's kind of refer to Job in all of this, because Job lost his family to a mighty wind. Job lost his wealth to war and fire, and Job lost his health to painful boils. And through it all, God never told Job why what was happening to him was happening. Now, get the point I'm trying to make here. Because you're going to come to this, and many of us are there now. I don't need to know. I don't need to know. And the reason I don't need to know is because I trust him. God's not going to let anything happen to me unless it's for my good. And it may include, in fact, it's going to. I have no doubt in my mind. It's going to. Suffering comes in so many different ways. There's a suffering of the body. I don't think that's the worst. I don't. I've had very minimal suffering in my body. I guess, I don't know, maybe the worst pain I've ever had was the heart attack. I'm not even sure if that's true. And when I was helping Brother Ashcraft move, me and Rick Lotspeech and a couple of other young men, and as we were lifting this heavy furniture, and I'm saying, take the drawers out, it'll make it a lot easier. No, we can do it. We're men. We can do it. That's what they were doing. And I threw my back out, and they had to rush me to the hospital. Well, they had fun making fun of me all the way over to the hospital. I was never so mad in all my life. But you know what? Pain and suffering is going to come. It's just going to be there. And when it comes, when God finally did speak to Job, he didn't even reveal to him then that it was a bargain that he made with the devil to test Job. Job never did know that because God never did tell him. And bottom line is, Job didn't need to know it. After all was said and done, he just trusted God. There's a lot of peace in that. A lot of peace. Do you remember what God did when Job came before him and when his miserable comforters were there? He never revealed why he was going through the suffering. I think that would suffice. But there's a reason that God didn't do that. And you never find anywhere when Job finally realizes at the end of the book of Job, when he finally realizes what all this is about, and God never did reveal anything to him, God never apologized to him either. He never said, Job, I knew that it would turn out this way. He never apologized to him. This has to do with the sovereignty of God. Instead, how did God deal with Job when, I don't want to really call this complaining. I guess it's all right to call it complaining, but you understand what I'm talking about. Job, he was in total confusion. Because these guys were saying, if you were right with God, you wouldn't be. They had a wrong theology in that day. If you're right with God, you never suffer. And we got that theology around us today. Send me $20 and I'm going to bless this handkerchief and I'll send it to you and you put it on that painful spot and you're going to be okay. And I don't know, maybe psychosomatic things that works with, I don't know, but it's not true. I know that. And so he doesn't apologize to him, but how does he reveal himself to him? God, when he does speak to Job, he talks about mountain goats giving birth. I mean, come on, think with me. You're laying there covered with boils. Your whole family's been killed. You've lost all of your wealth. And when God comes to talk to you, he talks about goats. Well, he did. He not only talked about mountain goats giving birth, he talked about young lions on the hunt. He talked about ravens in the nest. All of it seems detached. He cited the behavior of the ostrich, the strength of the ox, the stride of the horse. He cited the wonders of heaven, the marvels of sea, and the cycle of the seasons. Now, why was he doing that? That would have irritated me. Well, if Job was irritated, he doesn't reveal it because Job was left to conclude one basic thing. If God had the power and the wisdom to create this physical universe, there was reason to trust God in the times of suffering. We need to think about that. I don't know how to create something out of nothing. I don't know how to do what God has done because I can't. That kind of God is worthy to be trusted. Especially, I don't have it in my notes here, but especially when you begin to think about what he reveals about himself. Yeah, he's a just God, and so that demands certain things, but he's got to love. And how comforting to know that even in the midst of my suffering, I cannot be loved any more than what God loves me. It is the deepest, most perfect kind of love there is. And to know that whether I am in sin or out of sin, he loves me the same. I can't make him love me more. I find comfort in that. I want to read you what Job had to say in Job 42, verses 1 through 3, and then 5 and 6. Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that thou canst do everything, and that no thought can be withholden from thee. Who is he that hideth counsel without knowledge? Therefore have I uttered that I understood not, things too wonderful for me which I knew not. I have heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now, through his suffering is what he means, but now mine eye seeth thee. Wherefore I abhor myself, and repent in dust and ashes. And that's what happens. We were over visiting just before church tonight. Olivia Shepherd is in the hospital with some kind of a kidney infection. And John and Nana was there. When Nana's there, everything's okay. That's what I was telling the kids. And Kylie went with us, and that just brightened their day. But we need to pray for them. And all those things just come to my mind. Just tonight, today, this week, it's been a week of stuff like that that's going on. But no matter what your suffering is, there's one thing I've said. I can't even tell you how many times I've said this. I don't say it to lost people, but I always say this to save people. Next time you're in the hospital, the next time you're suffering, and a suffering that goes beyond physical suffering. Do you understand what I mean when I say that? I think the older folks do. If you've ever had depression in your life, I know you do. You know what I'm talking about. Listen, depression's a terrible, terrible thing. I know. I have it. It's a horrible, horrible thing. Somebody else in our church who suffers from depression made this statement to me, and it just hit me like a ton of bricks, because it really put in a capsule summary for me why depression is so horrible. It isn't that it's always a gloomy day. It isn't that everything is looked at and through eyes that are expecting the worst of things. It's not that. This person said to me, the worst thing about depression is you feel like nobody loves you. I'm going to be open with you and honest. Through the depression of my life, many times in the 31 years that I've been here, going on 32 now, hard to believe. There have been many times I thought, you know what, there's nobody in that church that loves me. Nobody. I've thought that. It wasn't true. I'm just trying to get you to see my condition and the condition of anybody else that suffers from depression. Even though you're being loved and the love's being expressed, you think, but there's a hidden agenda here. They don't really love me. If I didn't have something to give to them, they wouldn't really love me. When God helps me is when I look at her and I think, she didn't love me either. Then I know this is just Satan whispering in my ear, trying to trap me. Ever felt that way? We have a number of people in our church that have been very open about that, and through the years have come to me and said, Brother Stayton, I'm having real depression bouts. I think it's depression bouts. Can you help me? And I say, well, the first thing that we need to do in getting you help is you go to a doctor. You find out whether this is physiological. Because if it's physiological, you'll be amazed. They can give you, if you can tolerate the medication they give you, I can't. But if you can tolerate the medication that they give you without the side effects that can come from them, it's an amazing drug. All of a sudden you have a sense of well-being. You're no longer looking at life through these clouds that you're looking. All of a sudden you look at people and think, hey, they're great people. I thought they were terrible yesterday. These are pretty good people. You look at things as they are. That's what you do. But a person who's given depression, they don't look at things as they are. They look at things in a distorted way. And they need help getting out of that. And so there are people that have done that and come out and say, this is amazing stuff. So glad that you recommend it. I go to the doctor. I feel so much better now. I mean, I feel like everybody loves me. Nobody hates me anymore. Well, that's how those things go. But here's where we associate our suffering. This is the most important point in the whole message. the crucifixion and suffering. I'm going to summarize this because I've written down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things, but really that's not going to make a difference. We don't know. We've never suffered on the level that Jesus did. I'm not talking about nails in his hands. I'm not talking about the spear in his side or the thorns on his head. I'm talking more about being stripped naked in public, being spit in his face. I'm talking about humiliation. And the most important thing of all, what does it mean? What kind of pain is involved in suffering and bearing the sin of the world? Forget about the sin of the world. Bearing my sin. What does that mean? What kind of suffering is that? I'm blank. I just draw a big blank. Okay, let's think of the worst suffering that we've ever seen. Donald Seward comes to my mind. I've used him many times through the years as an example because it shocked me. It shocked me. A 14-year-old boy, somewhere around 14 years old, and he was hit by a bus, by a school bus. And when I finally ran up to where he was at, I saw him lying on the ground, pitiful sight. Bus driver standing just barely off from him, sobbing. He's crying. An old man is what he was, seeing me back in those days. Remember, I'm about 14 years old too. And I see Donald Seward lying in the street, and his mother is cuddling him in her arms. He's leaning, his back is against her breast, and she's got her arms around her head's down, and she's sobbing too. And I look down, and there's his leg, split wide open. I can see the bone, just as clear as day. I can see the bone. And he's in utter confusion, not in pain. He didn't seem to be in pain. Utter confusion. Then I hear the sound of a helicopter that's landing over in a field, and they come up with a stretcher, and they pick him up, and they whisk him away. He died 3 months later. I knew there was a lot of suffering going on there. But the suffering Jesus did supersedes all that. He gives it to us in his word. He talks about it. But I have a hard time relating to it. But I do know this. I remember this very distinctly, and many of you have shared these kinds of things. Back in 1996, Scott's standing by my side, Donna's standing by my side. Sam had just left, not even 15 seconds. I blame him for my heart attack because of that. 15 seconds, he's gone, and I have a heart attack. I feel like my chest is going to burst right through my heart's going to burst right through my chest. And I remember that as they're rushing me down on this gurney and trying to get me where I needed to be to get emergency surgery, I got 1,000 things going through my mind. It wasn't my whole life going before my eyes, but 1,000 things. But here's one thing that I remember. This doesn't compare with the suffering of Jesus. As bad as that suffering was, it didn't begin to compare the suffering of Jesus. I remember thinking that. Look, here's the point. I said this to Carolyn, and she got real quiet. When you have suffering, no matter what the level may be, but especially when your suffering seems to be taking you beyond the point of bearing it, that's when you relate it to Jesus. You'll be amazed what will happen. It was after that. I don't mean to bore you with this, and I know some of you get bored with it, but it was after that, and after the surgery was done on me, lying in intensive care, unconscious. I'm barely hearing a voice. Find out later they're all trying to wake me up, but nobody could wake me up. But I heard Donna's voice. It's the only voice I could hear. And I remember that through all of that, I wanted to reach out and touch her. And I was trying to reach out, but I couldn't. My hand wouldn't move. And then I thought, oh no, I'm paralyzed. Now that frightened me, and the reason it frightened me is I knew how my mother suffered through paralysis the last 2 years of her life, completely paralyzed, except for her eyelids. You related to Jesus, that's my point. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 21. For even hereunto were you called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that we should follow his footsteps. Rabbi Harold Kushner's book, many of you know about this book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. It's a bestseller. It not only was a bestseller because it was written so well, but it was a bestseller because it spoke to a need in a self-absorbed age. Let me give you a quote from his book. He says this, "For us, any suffering, confusion, or tragedy is patently unfair and undeserved because we stop trusting a God whose presence makes suffering, confusion, and tragedy bearable." The eighth point is God's comfort in suffering. The Apostle Paul pleaded with the Lord to take away an unidentified problem in his life, a suffering problem in his life. I personally believe that it was his eyesight. I think that he realized, or at least in his own mind, he thought this: if God would give me my eyesight back. I don't mean that he was totally blind or anything like that. I think he probably had a stigma of one kind or another. It made it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to write or to read. Most of the books that he wrote that we have in the New Testament were written by someone else. He dictated to them what to say exactly, and they wrote down exactly what he said. Sometimes that frightens people, but that's a fact. That's exactly what happened. And through this unidentified problem that he had, he was only asking on behalf of his effectiveness for God in the work. And I think probably the way he prayed was like this. You're not going to find this prayer exactly in the Bible. But I think he was saying, "Lord, give me back my eyesight. Give it back to me on the road to Damascus. From that day on, those cataracts that were on my eyes that you took off, and now my eyesight's never been the same since. Give it back to me so I can be more effective in your work." I think that's what he prayed. And how did God respond to that? You all remember this, don't you? Let me read it to you. "And God said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you.'" Here it is. "For my strength is made perfect in weakness." Now that, you can think on that the rest of your life and never exhaust that thought. That's powerful stuff. When I am weak, God is strong in my life. The reverse of that is true. When I am strong in my own eyes, then I am weak and really not strong. See, the whole point that he's making for us here is that God operates solely, always, on a basis of grace. Grace is beyond the need in their own mind of the proud people of this world. They would never say, well, most of them would never say, particularly Christians would never say, "I don't need God," but they live that way. Paul went on to say, "Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities and reproaches and necessities and persecution and distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then am I strong." He learned that through suffering. There are lessons that can only be learned through suffering. No other way. And so I say that to you because one of the things that we need to understand is that when God allows suffering in our life, you can mark this down, He's giving a lesson that you cannot gain in any other way. Can't. Point number 9 is the crises of suffering, and here's what I mean by that. The times of crisis, and in times of crisis, we find one another. I pointed that out for that little bit of DVD that I gave you on 911. And when I gave that to you, you heard the background. Again, I heard it last night as I was watching. My God, my God, my God, with great feeling. People run around, my God, my God, my God. You're just like me. I feel the same way about that. I know. I don't mean to offend you. But I do want to make a point with it. Because they weren't really talking about calling out to God and seeking help. They weren't doing that at all. It was like a slang term, an expression of anxiety in their life. Oh my God. That's what it was. That's disturbing. But it's in times of crisis when there's hurricanes and fires and earthquakes and riots and illnesses and accidents and people going in the hospital and all of that people come together. I said to Nikki Shepard, she came in with a shopping bag full of things from McDonald's for the entire family. A lot of people were in there already. And I said, wow, you're anticipating a lot of the church coming tonight after church, aren't you? And she just kind of laughed. And I said, once I announced that he's in here, there will be people coming over for sure. And they just smiled. Isn't it wonderful when we do that? When things are going on in our life and people come to say, I care. What a dumb mistake I made. When I had the heart attack years ago and I asked for nobody to come. Joe, thank you for ignoring me during that period of time and coming anyhow. And I'm not putting others down who didn't. I know Tex Amex told me he stood out the door and prayed for me because of the sign I had on the door. That was a very foolish thing to do. There's not a better time for your friends to be around than when you're suffering, when they can express love to you. Curtis, thank you for that time when I was in the hospital and you called me. And Donna told me, she said, honey, it's Curtis. Because she knows how I am. We talk about those things. And I started crying. I just started bawling. All she had to say was, it was Curtis. It's on the phone. I just started bawling. Your emotions are so high in times like that. Listen, folks, we need each other in suffering. We need each other. Some of you are great about that. Thank God for you that you are that way. We need to remember that each time we find God in our suffering and somebody ministers to us in our suffering, there's an obligation that goes with that. Here it is in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. Blessed be God, even the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies, and the God of all comfort, who comforteth us in all our testings. The word tribulation means testings. That we may be able to comfort them which are in any trouble by the comfort wherewith we ourselves are comforted of God. Donna was uncertain as to whether Kylie should go into the room when we went to see Olivia tonight. Weren't sure just who all would be there, and they were standing out in the hall against the opposite wall from room 105, and I was standing in there, and I looked down, and Abby looks at me, and she looked out in the hallway, and her eyes just lit up, and a big smile came on her face. And I thought, wow, somebody's out there she likes. And I looked, and she was looking at Kylie. Made a difference in her life. Now, I could say that for me, let Kylie or any of my grandkids come in the room, and it's going to light me up. You're the same. Grandparents, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It lights you up. But we need to also know that there's sometimes that there's people like that in life, aren't there? There are. Some of you are wonderful at that. Laurie Eaton is, I pray you don't move away. We kid you a lot in this church. But you are so loved by this church. And you deserve it. You have crept into all of our hearts. She puts up with Mickey, don't you? I was kidding you about that. There's people that are good about that. We want to do that. We want to be the kind of people that light up people's lives. Last thing. God controls suffering. He can turn suffering around for our good. Through Job's suffering, we see a man who not only came to a deeper understanding of God, but who also became a source of encouragement for people for every generation to follow. He wrote it down, and we're preaching it tonight, and people preached it and preached it and preached it hundreds, thousands of times, maybe millions of times since the time of the Apostle Paul. And so when we see someone who is suffering, just like when Joseph, a man named Joseph, you all remember about him, he was able to say to those who had hurt him, some of you need to listen to this, to those who have hurt him, he said, but as for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save much people alive. We need to always remember that. Suffering in our lives has not caught God by surprise. We can look at that and blame others and have horrible feelings about it, but the bottom line of it all is that no matter what anybody means toward you through whatever goes on in your life that causes you to suffer, God's going to bring good out of it and not evil. The difference that may be there is that Joseph saw this and understood it. Now, I have given to you, because we're really on the subject of forgiveness right now, but that has a great deal to do with suffering and how it's going to impact your own life. I want to end this with an illustration that's one of my favorites. It's only a paragraph long, and I'm going to read it to you. But just think how horrible it could get in the times come. I'm going to stay away from that. We don't know what the future holds, do we? We don't. This prayer was found in the clothing of a dead child at Ravensbrück concentration camp. O Lord, remember not only the men and women of good will, but also those of ill will. But do not remember all the suffering they have inflicted upon us. Instead, remember the fruits we have borne because of this suffering, our fellowship, our loyalty to one another, our humility, our courage, our generosity, the greatness of heart that has grown from this trouble. That was a child. I don't know the name or the age, but it's a child. Prayed that prayer. I'm going to finish with what F.B. Meyer had to say about suffering. If only we could see the path as God has always seen it, we would have selected it as well. Someday we're going to see that. You'll understand why the path you're on, God allowed it and even directed it. He makes no mistakes. And all you got to do is call out to him. Well, my eyes comb our congregation, and it just flashes in my mind. People can cause a lot of suffering. You don't have to let it have an ill effect on you. That's bottom line. You don't. Make sure you don't. Let's bow together for just a moment. This is part of the service where you take what's been taught to you and given to you and how God has spoken to you and you apply it. It may be that all of a sudden, just one phrase, unbeknownst to me how God's using it in your life, but he brought back some pretty bad memories for you. And he did it because he wants you to release it. Let it go. Let some good come out of it that he has in store for you. He does. For some, he's preparing you. Because tomorrow, that'll bring a new day with all the hopes that we have in every new day. It will also have its share of suffering. He wants us to be prepared. He wants us to get honor and glory for himself through our lives. That is our purpose in being. Through the suffering days and through the non-suffering days. So just take a few moments. Commune with your God. Express your love to him. Let him know you're anxious to be with him.